Retail Touchpoints, and I'm here speaking to Steve Dennis, who is the president of Sageberry Consulting and a well-known retail industry expert. He's going to be speaking at Retail Touchpoints Live, which is the event coming up on June 25th and 26th in Chicago at McCormick Place, and his topic of his presentation is going to be Remarkable Retail, Winning in the Age of Amazon and Digital Disruption. So I thought I would dive right in and say, how do you define remarkable retail, Steve? What goes into that?
Well, hi, Adam. First of all, thanks for having me.
No, glad to.
I mean, remarkable, I guess, from two perspectives. One is, I think that given how competitive the industry is, given how many choices the customer has, what used to be good enough is no longer good enough. And so I think retailers really have to stand out from the crowd by offering something that's really customer relevant, unique, and powerful. So from that sense, that's part of what I mean by remarkable. But I also mean it in the sense that some listeners might know Seth Godin used in his book Purple Cow, which is literally that the experience or the brand is so strong that people will talk about it, will remark about it. And that'll be a source of additional advertising, I guess, as well.
Okay, great. So the session description also references the power of smaller format stores. I'm wondering what you see as some of the key ways these smaller stores can benefit both retailers and the consumers, the shoppers.
Sure. So what I've seen generally is there's really two fundamentally different types of smaller stores. There would be what I would call kind of the shrunken store, where a retailer like Target, for example, has come up with a format that is significantly smaller than their standard store. And usually that's to try to get into an urban location, because of the cost of real estate or the difficult finding sites. So they've really tried to develop a format that's not too much of a compromise, sort of brings the best of what they do, but doing so in a package that's maybe a third smaller, let's say. And I think the advantage to the retailer of that approach is it makes many more, or a substantial number, of new stores opportunities available to them. And from the consumer standpoint, they now get that retailer closer to them than they might have otherwise gotten. The other sort of format I think we're starting to see is what Nordstrom is doing with their local concept, which is a completely different kind of small store. It's a store that's really built from the ground up. It's not a shrunken version of a big store, but it's really a small format that is completely a completely new concept. So for people that aren't familiar with Nordstrom Local, it's about 2,000 square foot store, so much, much smaller than a typical Nordstrom store. It doesn't carry any merchandise. It's really a service-oriented store. So it's a place where you can return product, you can order online, pick up product, you can meet with a stylist, so it's really service-oriented. And I think the advantage, again, for Nordstrom is that they can open many more locations because they don't need the massive amount of space they would need, or a mall location to do their standard format. And it allows them to really grow market share. And from a consumer standpoint, particularly from a service aspect, again, it's much closer to where they are. It's easier to get in and out. So there's really two different kinds of approaches.
Gotcha. Okay. I was wondering if you could give me what you see as some positive examples of the use of digitally enabled technologies to empower in-store customer engagement. And what are some of the elements that you feel make those engagement technologies work well in retail?
Sure. So if I understand your question, and correct me if I'm not getting at the heart of it.
Okay.
One big aspect, I think, is using mobile technology to really bridge the gap between e-commerce and physical stores. So I think, for example, a lot of people have probably used the Starbucks app. To me, that is a great way of thinking how you can really be remarkable throughout the customer journey. So if you want to order ahead, if you want to check your loyalty points, if you want to give the barista a tip without having to pull out your credit card, all those sort of aspects, I think, are a way that the shopping experience is enhanced by a digital device. The other type of thing I think we're seeing more of is where sales associates are being armed with some sort of smart device that really helps them better serve the customer. I think one of the real challenges, particularly in stores that where the consumer is trying to get more advice and help, is so many customers come into a store now having done their research online, and so they're very focused in what they're looking to do, and maybe they've checked all sorts of competitive products and prices and so forth. And so when they show up in the store, and many times they're really more knowledgeable than the sales associate can be. And so it often puts the sales associate at a real disadvantage. So I think what retailers like Nordstrom and Apple and others have done is arm the sales associate with a tablet or some way of being able to help that customer more proactively, in a more informed way. But also, if it turns out, for example, the product's not in stock, then the sales associate can just right there look online or look in the point of sale system and see if they have it at another store and say to the customer, well, we can ship it to your home, ship it to your office. You don't have to let that customer out the door having not been able to sell to them.
So it sounds like for both of those, and yes, that's absolutely the things I was asking about. It sounds like both of those types of engagement remove friction from the process, whether it's the customer's own technology through an app or a mobile website, or the salesperson wielding the technology. It takes away a lot of the pain points and the humps.
Yeah, I think that tends to be the big thing. I often try to think about, I think sometimes there's almost too much emphasis on this idea of frictionless. I think that absolutely there are plenty of opportunities for retailers to take friction out of the process. But I think the other thing is, how do you surprise and delight the customer by finding something that's really special? Because I think, customers will put up with a fair amount of friction if they ultimately get a really remarkable experience or product on the other end. I mean, people line up for the latest Apple release. That's quite a lot of friction, right? But it's worth it because the payoff, they believe, is there. So I think it's really working on both sides of the equation, eliminating the friction, but also trying to find places where you can really amplify the experience and do something memorable.
Okay, great. So you've been sounding the alarm for a while about the retail's boring middle, as I believe you refer to it. And also, I read one of your pieces saying that Wall Street loves the idea of shrinking to prosperity, but you haven't seen a way that brands can do it and retain their scale. Is there a way for brands to, quote, shrink to prosperity, unquote? And if there isn't, I guess the second part of the question would be, can the mid-range department stores, which many of them have been struggling, can they do this and still rebuild to their former relevance or some level of relevance?
Sure. So there's a fair amount to unpack there. So I'll try to take it a piece at a time. So when I talk about the collapse of the middle, I'm really getting at this idea that if you look at what's happened within retail over the last few years, you see a lot of strength at the value side of the equation, whether that's Walmart, Ross, TJX, the more price-oriented, convenience-oriented stores, and at the other end of the spectrum on the more experiential, premium, service-oriented stores. But when you look at where the sales and profit problems are and where the vast majority of store closings are, it's these retailers that are really not, strongly at either end of the equation, this middle part. And so I think the challenge, so if we get to the moderate department stores in particular, I think there's two levels of challenges. There's the strategic positioning challenge, which is, is your brand known and really distinctive or remarkable or memorable at any particular thing? So are you great at value, convenience, assortment, eliminating the shopping friction? Or, are you really providing something where the product or service is really highly differentiated? And, most of these department stores haven't really picked a lane. They're still mostly targeting, a little bit of everything for just about everybody. And they've got a massive investment in physical stores that are in many cases disadvantaged locations. They're too large. They haven't invested in their physical assets in many cases. And so that's a much bigger issue to deal with than some of the executional challenges of, maybe not having more up-to-date merchandise or, have too many sales or not a good loyalty program or leveraging data. So I'm not particularly optimistic about the moderate department store challenge because I think it takes so much to change the consumer's opinion of your brand, and it takes so much investment to reposition yourself and reposition the real estate. And, if they had started 10 years ago, perhaps they would have been able to do it. But I think in many cases, the window's closed, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's they certainly are finding themselves in a tough spot of they can't seem to stay where they are, but changing is difficult and challenging. Sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I often say that the problem with a lot of retailers that are struggling today is not all about blaming Amazon or blaming the internet. It's really that they watched the last 20 years or so happen to them and didn't respond. There's no fundamental reason in most cases why most of the retailers that are struggling today could not have performed much better. Department stores were in trouble well before Amazon had any significant share. So it's not as if the internet ruined ruined the department stores or Amazon has done it. I used to work, as I think I used to work for Neiman Marcus, which has had some of their own struggles. But, Neiman saw the potential in the internet many, many years ago and invested in it. And now 30% of their sales come from online. There's no fundamental reason why other retailers couldn't have done that. They just didn't.
Okay. Well, let's turn to some positive things. I was curious of what do you see as some of the exciting growth areas for retail in 2020 and beyond going into this coming decade?
Sure. So I think from one of them we talked about, I think there'll be a lot of exploration and perhaps investment behind some of these smaller formats. I think that being able to get closer to the customer and finding ways to open new locations is going to be attractive to a lot of retailers. So I think a little soon to tell how that's going to play out, but I think that's pretty exciting. We're seeing a huge amount of growth in the digitally native vertical brands getting into their own retail stores, but really putting together this more harmonized experience where they're not too caught up in the difference between e-commerce and physical stores, but they're really providing this experience that's channel agnostic and very technology enabled. I think the application of artificial intelligence to help personalize the customer experience and marketing, I think, has a lot of potential that's just really starting to be tapped. So, the promise of personalization has been out there for a really long time. And I think we're actually starting to see it be not only more cost effective, but actually working better with companies like Stitch Fix and others that are applying it. I think those are probably, the big ones that I think. Robotics certainly is something that I think most of the robotics applications are less customer facing. They're more behind the scenes in the supply chain.
Yeah, more in terms of the operational and execution side. Okay.
Excuse me.
Beyond the issues you've already identified in terms of the boring middle or the challenges facing the department stores, what are the other big challenges that the industry is facing today?
Well, I think, some of this does relate to the department store sector, but, we've got this kind of massive repurposing of real estate. We've got a lot of malls that are doing very well, but we also have a lot of malls that are really struggling. Just as a quick example, I'm here in Austin and I went over to a mall here last night, and to me, it was everything that is wrong in retail. Today, you had a former Sears, you had a JCPenney, that's a mess. You have about a third of the shops in there, which are just, not very interesting. And just, the sort of usual suspects in the food court. And, it's just very, very sad. And I think you see that story repeated, time and time again. I think there's a lot of pressure to reduce costs. We talked earlier, I didn't really answer your question about optimizing, this sort of downsizing to prosperity aspect. I think, there's so many cost pressures on retailers that in many cases that's contributing to their experience being more boring, because there isn't an investment in new products, there isn't an investment in interesting technology, there isn't an investment in customer associates. And so I think for retailers to figure out that right balance between using technology to get costs down and be more efficient, but at the same time really trying to find ways to be more effective and serve the customer in more interesting ways. I think that's a real tough challenge, particularly when business is soft in a lot of areas. But, a lot of it comes back still, I think, fundamentally to just understanding the customer's journey and how it's changed, and then finding ways to change your experience that really, as we talked about earlier, eliminate friction and amplify the wow or provide something. So I mean, a lot of that stuff's out there. It's just, there's a lot of pressure from financial forces, from the overbuilding that we're still dealing with.
Okay. All right. And we can't do an interview in retail without mentioning Amazon somewhere. So, and you already brought it up. So my question is, I mean, would you say it's been a positive force for retail in general, in that it's to some extent forced other retailers or competitors to up their game and improve their operations, or overall has it been a negative force? Has it been a negative force, I guess, would be the question.
So I'm going to give the decidedly mixed answer. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think there's clearly some positives. I think, as you point out, I do think that the amount of innovation that Amazon has brought to the industry has absolutely caused most retailers to up their game. And, ultimately, that means better outcomes for customers. The other big piece, which I say somewhat mockingly, but one of the great things about Amazon and a lot of these other so-called disruptive brands is there's been really a massive wealth transfer to consumers, because investors have been willing to fund many of these concepts that basically don't make any money. Amazon's only started to make money in the last couple of years in retail, and most of these brands that are very highly valued are basically burning cash. And the result is the consumer is getting, in many cases, really interesting product or really interesting service, or lower prices. And so, that's been an enormous benefit to the consumer. And certainly Amazon's the big dog there. But I think, the flip side of that investor phenomenon is there's still a lot of uneconomic pricing that exists. And I don't want to get overly philosophical about it, but, it's very tough for traditional retailers to compete when Amazon is basically not held to the same profit standards that they are. And so I think in some cases that's, put more retailers out of business or in trouble than might be desirable if we take the longer view. And I think just Amazon's, I'm kind of in the Scott Galloway camp, if you're familiar with his views on it. So I think, Amazon just has too much power at this point, and, just has the ability to move markets in ways that I don't think are good over the long term and will ultimately not benefit consumers. So I think it's a really mixed picture. But from an innovation standpoint and from a consumer value standpoint, it's absolutely been a big win.
Okay, great. Well, Steve, this has been, as always, a great conversation. I always love to hear your insights, and if people want to hear them in person and hear Steve go into some more depth about these topics and other related topics, as I said, he will be speaking at Retail Touchpoints Live. His session is on July 25th, but it's July 25th and 26th in Chicago. Again, Steve, thanks so much. As I said, it's always great to talk to you and hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Adam. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.